let's just review where we are. So, for the most part, we have covered about everything we need for our quiz next week. Covered basic genetics. We covered Punnett squares, pedigrees. The stuff we're going to do today is a little bit extra. There will be maybe a couple questions about this stuff on the quiz, but this is sort of giving you an introduction to things you learn about in ninth grade. So when we talk about chromosomes and genetics and genes and traits, okay, as we talked about at the beginning of this unit, our genetic material is found in our chromosomes, and it's found in a specific molecule, okay? DNA. DNA is the molecule that makes up our genetic code. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. Okay? And it's found in the nucleus of cells, makes up the chromosomes. Chromosomes are made of DNA plus protein. The DNA is kind of wound up around these proteins. And basically, in one single skin cell of your body, in the nucleus is your DNA. That DNA has all of the instructions that make you who you are in a tiny little nucleus of a cell. All of the information about you is stored in that tiny molecule. So our DNA molecules contain what we've been referring to as genes. They are coded for on the DNA molecule. A section of our DNA has a gene for eye color. Another part of the DNA molecule might have a gene for how to make insulin in our body. And another gene might be for our amount of pigment in our skin. And so we just have thousands and thousands of these genes that code for different things. So just sort of to give you some basic information about DNA. Each cell, if you were to take the DNA from a single cell, it's about 2 meters, maybe the length of your desk, all wound up in this tiny little nucleus of a cell that we see under the microscope. Okay? On average, humans have trillions of cells, 75 trillion. So if you were to take all of your DNA and sort of stretch it out lengthwise, okay, you go from the Earth to the Sun more than 65 times. That's how much DNA we have. And it is this tiny molecule. A human hair is 0.0001 meters in width, and DNA is much, much, much smaller than that.
Wait, so in our cells, it's so small.
Yes, it's so tiny, like when you looked in the microscope at your cheek cells and you saw a small, tiny little blue dot, that was the nucleus of your cheek cell. In there is the DNA that could stretch all the way across your desk if you were able, you could line it all up and unwind it. So for a long time, so Mendel, when was Mendel doing his research with the pea plants? Do you remember what time period we were in? 1800s, late 1800s, mid to late 1800s. So scientists knew a little bit about how we inherit traits then. But it took a while until scientists started to understand, like, well, where is this genetic information stored? How is it passed on from generation to generation? What molecule might it be made out of? And so they eventually worked all those things out. And then in the 1950s, 2 famous scientists, well, actually more than 2, figured out and sort of built a model that shows what a DNA molecule actually would look like. Their names were Watson and Crick, James Watson and Francis Crick. And they determined that the shape of the DNA molecule is the shape that you're familiar with. You know, if I show you this molecule, you know instantly it's DNA because of that shape. It's called a double helix. It's like a spiral staircase, like a twisted up ladder. And that's the code, that's your genes, they're in there. And the way that our DNA stores the information about us is it's made of this series of what we call bases. And there's 4 possible bases that we have in our DNA. We abbreviate them with letters. The bases are A, T, G, and C. And if you were to look at my DNA, and you took these billions of letters, my A, I would have A, T, G, C, 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 G, T, A, whatever it is, would be slightly different from your sequence of bases, which would be slightly different from your sister's, which would be slightly different from somebody else's, which would be very different from the sequence of bases in a plant or a dog. Okay? So the order of those letters determines our traits. So just like letters of the alphabet, we have 26 letters in our alphabet. How many words can you make out of those? An unlimited number of words. And that's how our DNA works, but it's a simpler alphabet. It's an alphabet of just 4 letters. But because it's so many letters long, it can store vast amounts of information. Good question. If you have a twin, an identical twin, you share the same DNA, the same letters in order, and that's why identical twins look identical to each other, because they have the same sequence of bases, of A's, T's, G's, and C's. Fraternal twins don't. Fraternal twins have DNA that's only as similar as brothers and sisters. It's not any more similar than that. I mean, they have the same birth, so good question. So we didn't really get into reproduction in our human body system yet, but so what causes identical twins to form versus fraternal twins? You imagine what we know about reproduction. How would 2 different babies get the exact same DNA? Right? Very close. But not quite the egg that split. Nope. It's a little bit later. Well, yeah, first a sperm cell carrying certain chromosomes fertilizes an egg cell carrying certain chromosomes, and that is fertilized, and it starts to become an embryo. But then that embryo splits in 2. And they continue to divide. And each of those grows into a fetus and is born. Because they came from the same sperm and egg cell, they have the exact same chromosome. They have the exact same DNA. Well then, how about fraternal twins? Well, let me go over this and then I'll answer your question. How would you get fraternal twins then?
2 sperm cells fertilize 2 egg cells.
Yeah. So sometimes when a woman ovulates and releases an egg once every reproductive cycle, sometimes she actually releases 2 eggs. Okay? Now they're 2 different eggs, so they have 2 different sets of chromosomes. And if each of those eggs gets fertilized by 2 different sperm cells, the 2 different sperm cells are also carrying a different combination of chromosomes. So each of those fertilized eggs is different from each other. They're just like brothers and sisters, but they happen to be born at the same time. So that's where fraternal twins come from. Mitchell?
How would a conjoined twin work?
Conjoined twins form when you have the same way as identical twins. 1 sperm cell fertilizes 1 egg cell. Okay, it splits, starts to grow into an embryo. Then it splits, but instead of completely splitting, the 2 embryos stay touching slightly. And they grow so that each one forms a twin, but that part of the embryo where they were touching is where they are conjoined together, that they share that tissue. Conjoined twins are always identical twins, okay? And they're always connected like part to like part, head to head or torso to torso or something like that. So that's the question. When scientists want to study, so here's the question. What about us is genetic in nature and what's not? Is whether or not I like broccoli, is that genetic? I don't know. I'm not really sure. Maybe, maybe not. Is my height genetic?
Yes.
Mostly. Is my eye color genetic?
Yes.
Yes. So one way scientists study these things, how about is my personality?
No. Well,
Is it my sense of humor?
no.
Is my interests? So some people say, yeah. So the way scientists, some of those we don't really know. Some of them are a combination. But what scientists do is they take identical twins that were adopted into two different families. So if identical twins are given up for adoption and then are adopted by two different families, scientists can follow them. Because they were raised in two different families, they grew up with different conditions, with different parents, and lived in different areas. So if those identical twins, as adults, what if both of them love broccoli? Well, maybe there's a chance that our taste for broccoli might be genetic. What if one hates broccoli and one loves it? Is that genetic? No, it probably has to do with, the foods you ate as a child and things like that. If they have the exact same interests, it might mean it isn't genetic. If they have vastly different interests, that tells us, well, maybe it's not genetic, maybe it's influenced by other factors. So everything about us is not just what genes we have. Like identical twins, certainly, they look identical. But as you get to know them, you start to pick up on some of the subtle things that have developed over their lifetime that's not just their genes. As we grow, our environment has effects on us, how our nutrition, our diet affects our height, and there's lots of things that also affect us that are not just our genes. And that's how identical twins start to gain like little things that you can recognize. All right. Oh, what I wanted to say about Watson Crick, there's also a woman scientist, Rosalind Franklin. They were working in England. And Rosalind Franklin provided one of the key pieces of evidence that Watson and Crick used to make their model. However, it was very controversial. They never really recognized her contributions to their work. She did not win the Nobel Prize. And so at that time in the 1950s, it was much less common to have women doing research in these universities. Obviously today it would be like no big deal, but then women were certainly facing a lot of hurdles in terms of being recognized for science, and that's an example of that. She really didn't get the recognition she deserved for having a huge contribution to what these scientists figured out. So one important thing about the way our DNA molecule is structured is it's a double helix. It has two strands that wrap around each other. And the bases that we were just talking about, they match up in a certain pattern. If you have an A on one side of the DNA, its matching base on the opposite side is a T. If you have a G on one side, you have a C on the other side. They're matched together. That's just to help you understand. They don't really look those colors, just to help you see the matches. Like green and red are always matched up here, and purple and yellow are not. Yeah, good question. So we're going to talk about sometimes the DNA bases that make our traits, sometimes they change. Sometimes they get changed. Certain types of radiation, certain chemicals could cause the DNA bases to change or a new base to be added. You know what it's called? What? Yeah, that's a mutation. Mutation is when, for some reason, a DNA base gets changed. And if the DNA base gets changed, some characteristic about that organism also could get changed. It can lead to some problems oftentimes. Yeah, we'll get to that too. Yeah, scientists are now learning how they could go in and actually change the bases of a person's DNA.
So they can tell, like,
Well, not so much, not that good. Yeah, but well, being in space has significant effects on like your body, so probably. So I don't know if you need a way to remember this. Apples and trees, cars in the garage. A and T, B and C. Mitchell.
If you learn that, if like a scientist learned to
It depends. So what scientists would like to do now, they still not really successfully done this. For example, if a person has diabetes and the certain cells in their pancreas are not producing insulin, scientists determine a way to fix that and change some of these bases to allow their body to produce insulin normally. If they could target the pancreas cells, they can sort of help fix that problem. But not every cell in the body would have that gene. In order to change something and have it be in every cell, when would scientists have to change the genes? Before birth. We'll go back even farther. Oh, hold on. Yes. But before, let me just get back to this question. So when does the DNA have to be changed to have every cell have that new DNA? Right, at fertilization. When you have a single cell, if you change the genes there, then when it starts to copy itself, those changes are in every single cell that comes afterwards. Or if you change the DNA in a sperm cell or egg cell and it fertilizes an egg, then those changes will be passed on for every generation. Okay? Yeah, they're doing it for lots of different things, lots of different treatments for different diseases. Well, you have to deliver those cells to the specific area where they're needed, the changes. So cancer is caused by our own cells starting to lose their normal regulation of when they divide, and they're dividing into tumors uncontrollably for some reason. But if scientists could go in, target those genes, and sort of turn off those cells reproducing, they could stop the progression of that type of cancer. But they could just deliver it to those specific cells that is necessary. That's like a huge area of like up and coming research. Like if you go to school and you become a doctor, researcher, geneticist, it's something that they're working on is how we can use our knowledge of DNA to treat diseases. All right. So if I had this sequence of bases on one side of the DNA, what would the other side of the DNA be? Well, what would the first letter be? G, A, T, A, G, T. So you see how they match up, right? So those we call complementary base pairing.
Is it possible for one
Then that would only come about because of like a mutation, a change in the DNA that's unplanned.
Wait, but if you did change your DNA and somebody else changed your DNA and you guys have kids, could there be a possibility of that happening to them?
If you were to change your own DNA, the only way a change to your DNA could be passed on to your children is if it were in certain specific cells. Which one? What? Yeah, because the only actual cell that a human passes to the next generation is one single sperm or egg cell. So if that sperm or egg cell, the DNA would change, it could be passed on to the next generation. But if you had a mutation in your skin cells, because you never wore sunscreen and you got too much exposure to ultraviolet radiation, that wouldn't be passed on to your children because you're just changing the DNA on your skin cells, not the reproductive cells. So the way that our DNA works is each set of letters is a code for a certain trait, for a certain protein. Okay? That, CAT might be a gene that specifies purple hair. Or TAC might be a different gene that specifies another hair color. That's the way our genetic code works. Basically, DNA is like a recipe about how and when to build specific proteins in our bodies. Our body is composed of proteins. It's made of proteins. They determine how our body works, what we look like. And so DNA is the recipe to do those things. So if we change, like we said, a base in DNA, we change the protein at a base. There's 3 types of mutations. Okay? Mutation is when the DNA is changed or altered or something. So sometimes one letter of the DNA is replaced with another letter. That's called a substitution mutation. Like an A got swapped for a D. Other times, a whole letter gets inserted in. That's called an insertion mutation. Sometimes a base gets removed. Close. Others think a computer.
Removal. Deletion.
Yeah, this is a deletion. And so if you change one of the bases, you change the protein that's in. Change the change. All right, I guess let's finish up. No, let's finish up with this on Monday, and then we'll review on Monday, because on Tuesday you guys are gonna have a quiz on genetics. I don't know, yeah, I gotta look at the quiz.